Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is, in my opinion, probably the most misunderstood mental health condition out there. Autism, I would say, gives it close competition. But the amount of misinformation about PTSD, not just on social media, where I expect to find it, but even among professional circles, is fairly shocking. There is a lot of, we'll say, differences of opinion on what PTSD is, how you should diagnose it, when you should diagnose it, how you should treat it. I personally believe that it is one of the most, if not the most, underdiagnosed mental health condition out there. And that's a fairly bold statement to make, considering it, depending on which data set you draw from, it is either the third or fourth most common mental health diagnosis out there. So it's not rare. Many, many people are out there diagnosed with it. And I think the people who are diagnosed with PTSD represent really a small fraction of the actual people that have it. It occupies a pretty unique spot among mental health conditions in that it cannot be inherited. PTSD cannot be encoded into your genetics. You cannot be born with it through brain chemistry or brain structure issues. Something has to happen to you. And that's not true for virtually any other mental health condition out there. It is a treatable condition. No matter what you think, no matter what you've been through, you are not permanently broken because of your trauma. And in fact, that belief that your trauma has permanently broken from you and you cannot recover from it, that is a symptom of PTSD. That thought is a symptom of PTSD. We will talk more about that later when we get into the symptoms. I want to give you guys just a brief outline here for what the content today is going to include, and then we'll dive right into it. We're going to talk about the causes of PTSD, including the definition of a traumatic event, another highly contentious topic. We're going to talk about the neurobiology of PTSD. I'll keep that one fairly surface level because this is not meant to be a professional level course on PTSD. This is more of a guide to you hopefully being able to understand yourself. But part of that does include understanding what is happening in your mind and in your body during traumatic experiences or triggers or flashbacks. We're going to talk about the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. We're going to talk about the symptoms of both conditions. I'm going to provide a brief overview of professional treatments of therapy for PTSD. And then lastly, I'll be talking about some practical strategies that you can use in your daily life, in your own coping and healing journey with PTSD. So let's get into the causes. First question we need to answer is, what is a traumatic event? How do we define a trauma? The short and probably frustrating answer is it depends. There isn't like some line in the sand where if the thing that has happened to you is objectively worse than this, it was trauma, and if it's not as bad as this, it's not trauma. There are many factors that appear to play a role in whether or not a person experiences an event as traumatic. The two biggest factors are the person's personality, which includes things like the intensity of their emotional reactions. For example, some of us feel our feelings more strongly than other people, and that can be good or bad. And when it comes to a traumatic event, some of us just might be a little bit more prone to experience high-level stressors as trauma rather than as stressors. It also is incredibly dependent on how the trauma is handled, like how does the individual cope with it and how it is handled by their support group. In some cases, I almost think that's more important. I have seen people go through unbelievably difficult things, and when they have a really solid support group around them who understands them, who validates them, and who, at least metaphorically, maybe even physically sometimes, holds their hand as they walk through what just happened to them, I've seen people come out the other side of some truly horrible things and not appear to develop PTSD from it. On the flip side, I have seen people go through things who, and this is with no judgment, this is just me saying it, on the full spectrum of trauma, have things that are maybe on the lower end of what would be considered a traumatic experience, but they just get no help whatsoever. Or in some cases, maybe the people around them even make it worse. If your support system ignores you or blames you for a traumatic event that you've experienced or does not help you access support, especially if you're young and don't have the ability to do it yourself, it doesn't take a lot to traumatize a person when that is what your help looks like. So it's also very dependent on who is around you and how they handle things. If you're skeptical about the idea that it's not just this objective severity level, think about the origins of PTSD. So as you may know, we first developed an understanding of PTSD with military veterans returning from war. And some people would be at war and would, see and experience horrible things, and it would be really hard for them. And then they'd come back, and after some adjustment period, they kind of went back to normal life again, and they were able to, rejoin their families and go work normal jobs and like live on their own and basically got back into their lives. And other people were not able to do that. Other people appeared to be permanently impacted or even disabled in some cases by what they experienced in the theater of war. And this wasn't just based on like, how bad did they have it? It wasn't that simple. It wasn't like, oh, this person was in like the worst part of the war, so every single person who like was in that combat operation, I'm not a veteran, so I don't know my terminology here. Every single person who did that or saw that or was there, they all have PTSD. And then everyone who was in this like area that saw less combat or whatever, none of them have PTSD. That's not how it went. Some of these people ended up okay, and some of these people ended up not okay. So it's not that simple. And that is really, really important for you to understand, because I do not want you guys getting into playing the trauma Olympics. What I mean by that is, like, let's say you know someone who has gone through something that you think is worse or is harder than what you've gone through. And that person does not have PTSD, or at least as far as you know, does not have PTSD. Do not then look at your own experiences and say, well, that person's experiences were worse than mine, so I cannot have PTSD because they do not have PTSD. That's the trauma Olympics, and that does not work. And that's a game that nobody wins, so please don't play it. It is also important for you to understand that it doesn't even have to be something that happened directly to you, especially if we're talking about things when you were young. People can develop PTSD from witnessing things. Maybe I should have said this earlier. I'm going to say it now. I forgot. A brief trigger warning for this episode today. I'm not going to be graphic. I'm not going to share any details. What I am going to do in order to have examples, and I guess I already did when I talked about war, in order to have some examples for how to explain this content, I am going to discuss categories of trauma. So I might just very broadly describe types of experiences that people have. And I just want to let you know that that will be included in the content today. So like if you grew up in a home where maybe one parent was abusive towards the other, but you yourself were never abused in any way, you just like saw this happening or heard it happening, can that still be traumatic? Absolutely it can. It absolutely can. You can, this is not as common, but I have seen this happen. People can even develop PTSD from learning about events that have happened. Typically, if it was something, pretty terrible that happened to someone really, really close to them, like if somebody you love dies unexpectedly, and especially if the details of how they died are like just really disturbing, you don't even have to have been there. You don't even have to have seen it. You can just learn that it has happened. And even that can cause people to develop PTSD in some cases. So yeah, basically in summary, the definition of a traumatic event is not this 100% set in stone thing. It is subjective, and it is somewhat based on who you are and how your situation is handled. Now, I want to briefly talk about PTSD versus CPTSD. So CPT, the C stands for complex, by the way, not childhood, which is what a lot of people think it stands for. Technically speaking, PTSD develops when a person experiences a single, like shocking, life-altering traumatic event. To give an example of this, and again, I'm not going to go into any detail here, but I worked with a client who was in the Las Vegas shooting at the Jason Aldean concert. Prior to that, and they were an adult at that concert, prior to that happening, this person had not experienced anything that they would regard as having been traumatic and did not appear to have PTSD. That event was so terrible for them, understandably, of course, that they developed PTSD from it. So one thing happened, they now have a diagnosis that they didn't previously have. That would be standard PTSD. CPTSD, or complex PTSD, develops from one of two scenarios. Either there is a repeated event, something happens like over and over and over again, or a series of even unrelated traumatic events happen. But because each of these events is traumatic on their own, they sort of have this cumulative effect. Like, it's not like once you have PTSD, if any other trauma happens to you, it doesn't make it any worse because you already have PTSD. It can get worse, unfortunately. They can kind of stack on top of each other. And that's basically what CPTSD is. So, like, let's say, this is again going to be a pretty vague descriptor. But if you experienced abuse in your childhood home, most likely that wasn't a one-time thing. It could have been, that is possible, but it's not typically something that just happens once. It's usually something that happens repeatedly over a relatively long period of time. That would be an example of the type of situation where a diagnosis of CPTSD would be appropriate or could be appropriate. Now, here's the disclaimer. CPTSD is not currently in the DSM. So the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. It's basically a giant book that has every mental health condition in it. CPTSD is not currently in that book. It is in the ICD-11, which is the medical manual of all diagnoses that can be given to a person. Typically, when a diagnosis that clearly is a mental health diagnosis gets added to the ICD, it usually does end up in the DSM. So like once upon a time, back in DSM-4, because I'm old enough to remember that, like binge eating disorder wasn't in there, for example. And autism spectrum disorder was just autism. And a lot of people who now fall on that spectrum were diagnosed with like PDD-NOS or Asperger's, which doesn't exist anymore. I'm not going to tangent that too far because that's a whole other thing. But basically, you probably don't have a diagnosis of CPTSD officially from like your therapist or your psychiatrist. It doesn't mean you don't have it. It means we're still working on the classification system, essentially. I want to move in now to talking about the neurobiology of trauma. So what actually happens inside of a person when they're experiencing something traumatic or when they're being triggered? There are two kind of working parts inside of you that are important for you to understand with regards to trauma. One obviously is the brain. The second is your nervous system. So trauma affects the nervous system arguably more than any other mental health condition. Autism and anxiety maybe are in there to a degree too. But trauma has a lot to do with your body as well. It's not just about your brain. One of the branches of your nervous system, which are just the bundle of nerves that run through your body and control basically all of your physical functions, is your autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system controls physical functions like heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, skin response, digestion, and sensory processing. And your autonomic nervous system basically has two modes it can function in, and not modes like a light switch, more like a continuum or a slider. Your autonomic nervous system has a sympathetic branch of nerves and a parasympathetic branch of nerves. The sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system regulates your fight or flight response. And so when it is more active, your heart rate is more rapid, your breathing is more shallow and also rapid. Your muscle tension increases because your body is preparing for action. It's preparing to either fight or flee. Your skin response, which is like sweating and stuff like that, goes up. You might notice that you sweat when you are triggered. Your digestion actually slows down, so people tend to get a lot of GI distress when they're triggered. And certain senses may tend to heighten. You may have a heightened sense of smell, a heightened sense of hearing. That one usually depends on what the trauma is or what the trigger is. Your parasympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system is your rest and digest mode. And so that's what's supposed to be, kind of running the show when there isn't anything scary happening. Now, the purpose of all of this is essentially to get your body working in the way that it needs to be for what's happening. So if you're actually in like a survival situation, if you're actually in, an acutely threatening life or death situation, all of those physical reactions become healthy. They become adaptive because your body is preparing to take action. One of the problems people face with PTSD is their nervous system almost gets stuck in that sympathetic mode, or it just gets there really, really easily. And so they spend a lot of time in this waiting for danger mode from relatively normal life events. Best example I can give for this is you probably have a home security system, right? Or I shouldn't say probably, not everyone does, but like many people, they're common these days. When I grew up in the 90s, they weren't common, but I did know one family who had one, and like they were not as high tech back in the day. And they had a really, really sensitive security system, and it would go off from just normal life events. Like if you dropped a fork in the kitchen, glass break alarm would go off. Or if it was really windy and branches started to scrape the window, again, glass break alarm would go off. This thing had probably 2 or 3 false alarms per day because it was so fine-tuned, because they were like really concerned about crime, I guess. I don't actually know why they had it. But that's kind of what PTSD is like to your body. It's like you had this security system and a break-in still happened. Your security system didn't prevent this threat from occurring. And so basically your body and your brain say, let's upgrade the security system. Let's make it more sensitive to make sure nothing gets through again, and at the cost of having a lot of false alarms. So you spend a large chunk of your day in this fight or flight response with those physical symptoms of sympathetic nervous system activation. Your brain is also very affected by trauma, not chemically, not nearly as much as something like depression or anxiety, but functionally. I'm going to explain this with something called the triune brain model. And I guarantee there's at least a few of you listening to this that just rolled your eyes and said, please don't do that. The triune brain model is admittedly a massive oversimplification of brain functioning. This is like not 100% accurate to what actually happens inside. But this would be like a 10-hour episode if I wanted to explain that. And it will give you enough information to understand yourself. That's the only goal here. So don't come at me about the triune brain model. So triune basically means like 3 parts. So the triune brain model separates the brain into 3 parts based on functioning. You have your hindbrain, which is like the back third, midbrain, which is the middle third, and your frontal lobes, which is like the front third. Your hindbrain is mostly responsible for basic bodily functions. And that includes basically all the stuff we just talked about in your nervous system. So your hindbrain sends and receives signals back and forth basically between the brain and the body. The midbrain is responsible for, among other things, feelings, memories, and threat detection. So there's a structure in your midbrain called the amygdala. That's basically your brain security system. So that's the part of your brain that's constantly scanning your environment for danger. And if it sees anything, it's triggering this response inside of you that says, okay, we got to go into this fight or flight response. Your frontal lobes, the front third, are responsible for things like problem solving, decision making, orientation to person, place, and time, communication, creativity, empathy. It's like all your high-level human stuff, basically. Now, you've probably heard this half-true saying that we only use about 10% of our brains. It's half true because you only use about 10% of your brain at any given time. You don't have like this secret 90% of your brain that you can unlock and gain superpowers or anything like that. But your brain doesn't use all of itself at once. It can't. It doesn't have the resources to do that. I'm pretty sure it would kill you anyway. So it's constantly redirecting like blood and oxygen and caloric energy to whatever part of itself it thinks you need for what's going on. So when your fight or flight response is triggered, it takes a lot of resources away from the frontal lobe. Because if you're actually in a mortally dangerous situation, you don't need those things. You don't need critical thinking if you're being chased by a bear. You don't need orientation to person, place, and time. You just need to be like a being of pure reactivity and instinct. And that's what all those changes turn you into. But again, the problem is when the trigger is actually harmless, because the frontal lobes contain basically all of the stuff you need to get out of the trigger, like critical thinking. Like that person looks like someone who hurt me, but they are not the person who hurt me. And so there is really no reason for me to have a fight or flight response to that specific human being. That's critical thinking. That lives in your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes become less active when you're in a fight or flight response. So you get into this vicious cycle of constantly being triggered and not having access to the tools you need to get yourself out of the trigger. That's the neurobiology of trauma in however many minutes that took me to explain. I want to talk about the symptoms now. And something you need to understand here is that these symptoms have to persist for at least a month beyond the traumatic event. If something just happened to you like a week ago, most of these symptoms I described here are probably going to be things you're experiencing. That doesn't mean you have PTSD. A reaction within a month of a traumatic experience is actually considered to be something called acute stress disorder. So there's a period of time where we'd say like, it's very expected for you to be impacted by a traumatic event, and you not, instantly recovering from it 10 minutes later doesn't mean that you have PTSD. So it has to be at least a month beyond the initial event. There are 4 categories of symptoms, and each category has several different examples that I'm going to give. The first category is what's called intrusion symptoms. And so these are usually like memories or replays of trauma that just pop into your brain that you aren't purposely triggering them. You aren't trying to think about them. The most common form by far is what's called intrusive memories. So you're just going about your day, doing your thing, and suddenly your brain's like, hey, remember this terrible thing? Boom, let's think about it. And it just pops in, and it's very distressing for you, and it's unwanted and you can't control it. We can also have nightmares about our traumatic experiences. So sometimes they're literal replays, or maybe it's not like a play-by-play, but it's similar enough to the trauma that we can clearly see, that was a nightmare about my trauma. Flashbacks, of course, can be a symptom. And a flashback is basically like a really, really powerful intrusive memory. It's one that's so powerful that you actually think the trauma is happening again. Flashbacks are sort of like the stereotypical PTSD symptom, and I think that's really unfortunate because in my experience, flashbacks are quite rare. Most people I work with who have PTSD don't have flashbacks at all. Like the majority do not experience flashbacks. And even those that do not have them happen very often. It's usually only in response to like a huge trigger. So the absence of flashbacks, if you're like, man, this kind of sounds like me, but I don't have flashbacks, that doesn't mean you don't have PTSD. You only have to have one symptom per category. And so flashbacks are a symptom of PTSD, but they are not in and of themselves a diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Whatever type of intrusion you experience, whether it's memories, flashbacks, nightmares, they also have to cause some type of distress in you. That could be psychological, like your mood. That could be physiological. Basically, they put you into a fight or flight response, like we said before, or it could be both. The second category of symptoms are what are called avoidance symptoms. And so trauma shrinks our world, and we stay away from things that remind us of the trauma. The avoidance can be internal or external. Internal avoidance of trauma would be trying to stay away from like thoughts or memories or feelings that make you think about your trauma. Avoidance of external stimuli would be staying away from people, places, activities, etc. But basically, we just try to hide from the things that make us feel or make us remember. And so there has to be some level of avoidance present for a person to be said to meet criteria for PTSD. The third category of symptoms are alterations in mood and cognition. These symptoms look a lot like a depressive episode with a little bit more like a mental disruption present. So they would include things like inability to remember important parts of the trauma. This one can go either way. Some people remember their trauma in like painfully accurate detail. Other people have these big gaps in their memory. And, no one perfectly remembers their life. So this would be like unexplained gaps, like entire years or months missing, where you're like, I should at least remember a few things from that period of time in my life. People with PTSD also tend to have persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about life. That one's hard for me to say out loud because I have a lot of negative beliefs about life and I don't think they're exaggerated. So obviously there's a little bit of subjectivity in this. But if you find yourself thinking or feeling things like every single human being on earth is out to get me, or like I can't leave my house and be safe, it's these really global, overgeneralized thoughts or feelings that keep us really, really stuck in our functioning. Those would be some examples. Distorted thoughts leading to inappropriate self-blame is another PTSD symptom. And this is the one I kind of teased in the introduction. If you walk around feeling like everything bad that's happened to you is your fault, and your brain is constantly trying to figure out, how could I have prevented that from happening? How could I have avoided that thing? That's a symptom. That's a symptom of PTSD. This is one of the most compelling ones for me because so many people don't realize that the way they think about their trauma is a symptom of their trauma. It is, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you've been through. It almost certainly was not your fault though. Just because you can find some theoretical thing, you're like, well, if I wasn't in this place on this day, that wouldn't have happened. Okay, maybe, but like, that's random chance. That doesn't make it your fault. I would assume that if you knew what was going to happen to you, you wouldn't have been there, and therefore it's not your fault. So anyway, I'm not your therapist. I'm just going to leave that there, but it's a symptom. Please know that it's a symptom. People with PTSD also tend to have persistent negative emotional states. So we have like much more long-term chronic feelings of like fear, horror, guilt, shame, even when nothing is really happening to prompt them. We tend to have a lot less interest in hobbies or activities or socializing. Basically, life starts to feel kind of frivolous when we're living with trauma. It's like, oh, that doesn't even matter anymore. Like, why should I bother doing it? And a decrease or even an inability to experience positive emotions. And so feelings like love or excitement or hope or joy or connection, they become very dulled, very numb, very like, if you know what anhedonia is, it's basically trauma-triggered anhedonia, if that makes sense. And the fourth category is alterations in reactivity. These look a lot like generalized anxiety disorder. We can have irritable behavior or angry outbursts. We can engage in more reckless and self-destructive behavior with just like less regard for ourselves in general. Hypervigilance is an important one to understand. Hypervigilance is this feeling of like always needing to watch your back, always being on guard. People who experience hypervigilance typically like to have their backs to a wall. They like to be able to see the exits in a room or the windows. They don't like people walking behind them. They don't like sounds happening from originating from outside of their field of vision. They just they try to keep everything in front of them at all times. That's a very common trauma symptom. Another is exaggerated startle response. So if you jump really easily to sudden movements or sounds, or even like, this is a little embarrassing, but I have one, is like, when you go to the barbershop and they wash your hair and like you close your eyes, or I close my eyes because it's awkward if you're just like staring at them. I know they're going to touch me. He's going to wash my hair. Of course he's going to touch me. And every time he touches, I freaking jump out of my chair. It's so embarrassing, but that's just an example of what that can look like. Difficulty concentrating, probably because of a lot of the other stuff we just mentioned. Your ability to like keep your mind on one thing, like schoolwork or your job, or even watching a TV show. When a part of your brain is just always on guard and is always like looking for threats, you're not going to be super like focused on other things. And I think that's pretty understandable. And a lot of problems with sleep. So insomnia, interrupted sleep. I don't think hypersomnia, which is when you need a lot more sleep, I don't see that a lot with PTSD. That tends to be more common with depression, but I suppose it could happen with PTSD as well. That's sort of the overview of PTSD. CPTSD has kind of a separate set of symptoms like on top of, so it's like those plus. And there's 3 additional symptoms that tend to go along with a diagnosis of CPTSD. The first is excessive reactivity to negative stimuli. So this is called affect dysregulation. This so often, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, so often gets mistaken for either borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. Basically, people with CPTSD tend to have extreme mood swings. Regular PTSD can cause that too, but it's more extreme with CPTSD. Like this person's mood can turn on a dime. And it's usually because of a trigger. It may be because of a trigger no one else sees or no one else understands, but it means something to that person. And it causes them to change in a way that looks very erratic and unexpected to everyone around them because they don't share your triggers. And so they're like, what just happened to you? And you're dysregulated, so you can't explain it. And it looks like you're just all over the place. The feelings of guilt and shame and worthlessness and self-blame tend to be even more chronic in individuals with CPTSD. It's just this constant sense of like, I am worthless. I am a failure. Everything is my fault. I am the source of all bad things in my life. And the third is severe difficulty forming or maintaining relationships. Basically, the triggers, the relational triggers and the interpersonal triggers that we see with PTSD, with CPTSD, they become so broadened and expanded that it's like all human beings. Like relationships don't feel safe. People don't feel safe. Nothing feels safe. If people are not being nice to me, obviously that doesn't feel safe. But if people are being nice to me, that feels safe too, or it feels unsafe as well, because it's like, what do they really want? What are they really after? When is the other shoe going to drop? What kind of game are they playing with me? And so basically every human behavior can be interpreted as a threat. And so you never feel safe around other people. And it goes without saying that makes it very, very difficult to form and maintain relationships. I mentioned misdiagnoses earlier. In addition to being underdiagnosed, well, I think a big part of the reason that PTSD is so underdiagnosed is because it gets diagnosed as something else instead. Because if you listen to all the symptoms I just described, if someone presented with those symptoms, but you didn't know that they had experienced one or more traumatic events in their lives, you would probably think that person either has depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or borderline personality disorder, because there is tremendous overlap in the symptoms. And this is why context is so important. Now, I get it. Like on one hand, if it's your family doctor or like a psychiatrist you've met twice trying to diagnose you, you don't know this person yet. And it's such a catch-22 because one of the symptoms of PTSD and CPTSD is difficulty trusting other people. But one of the only ways to not get misdiagnosed is to trust them and tell them that you've been through horrible trauma in your life. And then that might be part of the reason you're acting the way you're acting and feeling the way you're feeling and thinking the way you're thinking. So it's a really difficult situation, and I recognize that. I'm not going to claim to have all the solutions to this problem. What I'm going to say is, if you're diagnosed with any mental health condition, and you feel like, based on what we've talked about so far, you've probably been through at least one traumatic thing, and the person who diagnosed you doesn't know about that thing or those things, consider telling them, because that information likely would change your diagnosis and would also probably result in some changes to your treatments, which we'll be discussing shortly. As far as therapy for PTSD, there are three main types of therapies that you're likely going to see advertised as treatment for trauma. The first is what's called prolonged exposure therapy. It's often abbreviated as PE. Prolonged exposure therapy is a gradual exposure to triggers or to feared stimuli with the use of coping tools, grounding techniques, relaxation techniques. We'll talk about those shortly, that help you stay present and maintain your sense of safety and basically learn to get back out into the world and do things you want to do again without feeling constantly triggered in a very hierarchical, planned out way. So you start by doing something that's maybe like a 3 out of 10 on the difficulty scale. You practice it for a while with your therapy tools. And over time, your nervous system eventually says, you know what, this is fine. This is okay. I can pretty much do this whenever. And then you go on to the next most difficult thing. Exposure therapy can happen in one of two ways. It can be like places, things you actually go out and do, like in the community. You go to places or you do things, or it can take the form of just processing your trauma, like talking about it in session or doing journaling or things like that. So it's like internal versus external exposures. But both are going to follow the same general gradual exposure with self-regulation techniques strategy. And over time, your body and your brain basically regain their sense of safety in the world, and you're able to go out and do things and think and talk and do everything that trauma has taken from you. It can take a while, but it is a very effective treatment technique. Prolonged exposure therapy has been around since at least the 1970s, maybe even before under a different name. So it's not new. It's something we've been using for quite some time to treat trauma. It's probably the main modality I use in my trauma treatment, and it is pretty highly effective. You're also going to probably see, the most common one you'll see, honestly, is EMDR. That acronym stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. EMDR, basically, I'm going to give a disclaimer right as I get into this, somewhat of a controversial therapy. People have a lot of opinions about it. My take on EMDR, it is basically PE, it's prolonged exposure therapy with this bilateral stimulation principle. So there's a few different ways you can do EMDR. Sometimes there's an object moving around that you follow. Sometimes there's a headset you wear. Sometimes people hold buzzers that alternate. But the idea is you're trying to basically increase your spatial awareness, not increase your spatial awareness, but like direct your spatial awareness across a field of vision. So moving from left to right. And the theory is that by doing this, you actually sort of like supercharge the exposure therapy and speed up the progress you make in therapy. The controversy here is not about whether or not EMDR is an effective treatment for trauma. It seems that it pretty clearly is. The outcome data is really pretty clear on that. When you look at EMDR versus placebo, EMDR crushes placebo. So like it's a real thing. It does work. The tricky thing is when you look at EMDR versus PE, it doesn't necessarily show additional benefit. And since EMDR already includes exposure therapy in it, so like if you're doing EMDR, you might be following, I didn't really explain it very well. You might be following a light or holding these buzzers, and you're like thinking about or talking about your trauma while you're doing that. So you're doing exposure therapy as part of the EMDR. And so given that the treatment outcomes for EMDR are pretty similar to those of exposure therapy, there are a lot of people who believe that EMDR is basically just a highly marketed version of exposure therapy. The marketing component doesn't really affect you as a potential therapy client. It more affects like therapists like me because the trainings for EMDR are very costly. And to become an EMDR certified therapist, there's a lot that goes into it. And basically, it seems like maybe it's prolonged exposure therapy plus pseudoscience plus marketing. That's what some people believe, including myself. That's not bad. Like, again, I'm going to really hit this point home. It still works. It's still effective. As a therapy client, there's not inherently a reason not to do EMDR. But it often gets, I think, sold or described as like the only trauma treatment or the most effective trauma treatment. And those are both untrue, blatantly untrue statements. The third type of therapy for trauma that you're probably going to see mentioned fairly often is abbreviated as TF-CBT. And that stands for Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a treatment technique that is mainly used for depression and anxiety. And it involves a hybrid of looking at what a person thinks and how they believe, and like basically how we tend to interpret information in a way that already supports our views. So, if you're a depressed person and your depression has caused you to believe that you're worthless and a failure, you see your experiences and you see the world through that lens. And you interpret everything that happens to you as your brain subconsciously tries to find a way to support this idea that you're a failure. So with trauma, we also have belief systems, right? Belief systems like this is my fault, or I deserve this, or I did something wrong. And the cognitive part of TF-CBT is basically focused on understanding and then breaking down those belief systems that we tend to form and that then kind of self-perpetuate after one or more traumatic events. The behavioral side of CBT looks more at things like sleep hygiene, nutrition, again, exposure therapy, like getting back into your life, because trauma tends to just kind of stop your life for a while. And we don't want that to be permanent. We don't want you to be completely disengaged from things that give you a sense of like joy or accomplishment or excitement or connection. It can involve building habits, like working on daily habits or strategies that help you regain your sense of safety. Some of those might be small, some of those might be big, but really a lot of it is about understanding and modifying maladaptive beliefs and stories and getting back into living, a quote, healthy life again. I also do a lot of TF-CBT with people. In terms of medication for PTSD, there is no specific medication that has been explicitly designed for PTSD, but a lot of SSRIs, so that's medications like Zoloft, Paxil, Effexor, they can work on the sort of the anxiety and mood symptoms of PTSD, much like they would for someone with depression and anxiety. So those medications, I'm not saying there's no benefit to being on medication if you have PTSD. There just isn't a med that someone made and said, like, this is a med for PTSD. But because PTSD involves a lot of depression and anxiety symptoms, depression and anxiety meds can also help. There's also a medication called Prazosin that has been shown to significantly decrease the frequency of trauma-related nightmares in people. So if you are one of those individuals who experiences a lot of trauma nightmares, Prazosin might be worth looking into. Disclaimer with all that, I'm not a psychiatrist, so this is just stuff I've learned along the way. I do not prescribe psychiatric medication. My knowledge here is pretty surface level. Last thing I want to talk about with you guys are some practical strategies that you can use, ideally like as supplements to therapy, but if you're not in therapy, if you're against therapy, if you're having trouble finding a good therapist, I'm not saying these are going to resolve your trauma, but they can help it not completely take over your life. So triggers is a huge problem, right? Because it can be so undesirable to even like go out there and do anything, or even like watch movies or listen to music if you're constantly being bombarded by triggers. There's a website I want you guys to know about, and this is not sponsored content. I have no affiliation with this website. I don't even know if they make money, frankly. It's just something I've learned about. The website is called, it's kind of a weird name, but I'll explain it. The name of the website is doesthedogdie.com. And this initially was a website that was designed, like some people are really sensitive to like animal death or cruelty in movies and books and stuff. I'm one of them, by the way. And initially that's what this website was for. Cause like sometimes there's movies that are like, happy, lighthearted movies. And then like an animal dies in the middle of it. And it just ruins the movie for people with a certain disposition. But this website has basically been expanded into a giant trigger warning website for TV, movies, video games, books. You can pretty much type anything in there and it will give you this really exhaustive list of like, does it contain this type of content? And it has all the obvious stuff, right? Like, does this contain child abuse or sexual violence or suicide or things like that? It even has some things that I wouldn't have thought of, frankly. Like I don't know why this stood out to me, but I do know that some people have a phobia of this. It even tells you if people vomit in the media. And so it has just about anything a person could reasonably want. Obviously, it can be a little bit of like, it's kind of a bummer to have to potentially, like you see a trailer for a movie and you're like, oh, I might want to go watch that. I wonder how many triggers that has. And you have to like look it up, which can potentially spoil the movie a little bit. But that's a website I encourage a lot of my therapy clients to use. And it has, I don't even know how many triggers it has prevented, but it can be a real lifesaver, frankly. On the note of triggers, another thing to think about doing is modifying your environment, because environmental cues, especially in the places you spend most of your time, which is obviously going to be your home, maybe your work to some degree, Sights, sounds, just the general layout of things, colors, art, like so much can trigger memories. And if you've been through a lot of difficult things in your past and environments that you spend time in, even if they're not directly trauma related, if they look the same as they did during a period of trauma in your life, they can still be triggers just because they will prompt those memories. And there can be a lot of value in just switching things up, like getting some new art for your house or painting walls or rearranging your living room. These might seem very subtle, but orchestrating your environment so that it doesn't remind you of anything can be tremendously powerful. A few other things that can be really helpful to do on your own. Breath work. Unless this is the first piece of mental health content you've ever watched, you're probably sick of people telling you to do deep breathing, and I get it. But there is a reason that this gets discussed so often. And if we go back to the neurobiology of trauma and how the nervous system works, if you think about all the functions of your autonomic nervous system, they are all involuntary. They're all things that happen automatically. That's why it's called the autonomic nervous system. But there's one of them that you can take conscious control of, and that's your breathing. Everything else you can't take you can't directly take conscious control over your heart rate or your digestion or your muscle tension. You can do things indirectly that affect those or lower those, but you can't literally think muscles relax and they just do it. You can take direct conscious control over your breathing. And that's why it's such a powerful tool, because it's basically a nervous system hack. Because if you use your brain to direct your breath to become slower and deeper, what you're doing is you're actually communicating with your nervous system, and you're using your logical mind to tell your body, we are not actually in danger right now. We're okay. This is not what it appears to be. If you try to do that using words, which is what most people try to do, you get stuck, because you get to the point where mentally you're like, yeah, I know. I know this is just a trigger. I know I'm actually okay. And your body is like, I'm still freaking out, because your body doesn't speak English, but your body does speak breathing. And so breath work is a really, really powerful tool for management of trauma symptoms. And it's something, if you live with trauma, you should have a breath work practice in some way, shape, or form, because it's the only way you can really get through to your body that you're okay. Grounding exercises can also be really helpful. Grounding exercises are ways that you can essentially restore your awareness of the present moment and your sense of safety. Grounding or orienting, they can kind of be used interchangeably. Grounding would be like things that help you kind of be present in the here and the now, because trauma is all about the past, right? I mean, that's what the P stands for post. So like if you're in a traumatic situation right now, you technically don't have PTSD, you have acute stress disorder. If things happened in your past that are still causing you emotional distress today, one of the most effective ways to get away from that distress is simply to maintain conscious awareness of your distance from it. And, the opposite of that is a flashback. That's when that distance compresses like the ship from Event Horizon, and it's like you're back in the past or the hell dimension or whatever it was. Weird reference, I know. Some of you will love me for that. Others will be confused. Anyway, grounding exercises help you be back here in the present here and now. So if you tune into a present moment stimuli, and it doesn't have to be anything important, it doesn't even have to be anything exciting. Like if I'm feeling very triggered or if I'm feeling very caught up in my past, and I choose to focus on the feeling of the chair on my back and on my legs, or my feet on the floor, or maybe I put my hands on the desk and feel the texture, and you can't see my desk. Well, I guess you can over here. It has a wood texture on it. All of these things are present moment stimuli. And the present moment for me, right here, right now, is safe. I'm fine right now. I'm just in my office recording a video. And so if your brain can maintain awareness that it is the present and it is not the past, that's not to say you won't have any symptoms. But the further away you feel from your trauma, the less distressing it will feel. And keeping your awareness in the here and the now is one way you can do that. You can also do that with orienting exercises, which can be literally reminding yourself of the date, your location, the address, the season, or even just looking around the room and naming objects or colors or things like that. Because right now, my office here is surrounded by neutral stimuli. There's not a single thing in this office, and that's obviously by design, that triggers me. So I can tune into anything. I can look at And books actually aren't the best example because there is some traumatic stuff in those. But I can look at my YouTube plaque. That is a neutral stimuli. There's nothing traumatic about that. I can look at my calendar that I haven't updated in 2 months. This isn't going according to plan. Anyway, the point is it works. I can look at my Blade Runner script. I could look at my Me as Vegeta card. All of these things, if I really tune into them, they're not just random stimuli. They are signs that I am safe right now because they contain nothing triggering whatsoever. That's not an exhaustive list, but I'm realizing that this piece of content is now close to an hour. I generally try to keep it much shorter than that because I know that things like trauma and depression and anxiety, they all affect our focus, our concentration, our memory, our attention span. So obviously this was a little bit more of a comprehensive piece of content than I usually make. Let me know if this was helpful or if this was like too long and should have been broken down into 2 or 3 different sections. I'm open to either in the future. But I guess I would just want to end on this note. I know what it is to live with trauma. I know how much it can shrink your world. I know how terrifying it can be. I know how miserable and constraining it can be. It can make the whole world feel aversive to you. And I hope that some of the information and some of the techniques I've shared with you today, even if it, takes that away by 5%, then that was worth it to me. Hope you have a good day. I'll see you later. Take care.